What's going on, everyone? It's Phil from Earth, Nails, and Tails, and today we're going to take a deep dive into pruning our tomatoes. Some people are pretty intimidated on pruning your tomatoes. You think you're going to harm them or potentially negatively affect your tomato plants. However, pruning them can actually yield to bigger, healthier plants and more amazing fruit. I want to show you all of the principles that I use in my process so that way you can become a self-thinking tomato pruner. So first, let's dive on into the different types of tomato plants, and that'll be an excellent start for understanding the needs of each type. So the two main types of tomato plants are determinate and indeterminate. It's important to understand what these two definitions mean because it really affects how you're going to prune these plants. Determinate tomatoes are what we have here. These are 4 determinate tomatoes, typically Roma tomatoes. Determinate means that they're going to grow to a determined size and produce a determined amount of fruit. So your determinate tomatoes typically grow to around 3 to 4 feet tall, and they're going to produce their fruit all at the same time. On the other hand, we have our indeterminate tomatoes, which are going to grow to an undetermined height and produce an undetermined amount of fruit. That means they're going to continue to grow and grow and grow all season long until they're killed off by something like disease, pests, or for most of us, the frost that comes at the end of the year. So understanding the growth habits of these two different types of tomato plants is going to help us understand what type of pruning cuts we're going to make. There is one more type of tomato plant, and that would be your dwarf tomato plant, and it really has characteristics for both the determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, and it is a hybrid of both. The dwarf tomato plants, they have a determined height and they're very small, which is why they're called dwarfs. So they have the characteristics of a determinate tomato plant, meaning that they're going to grow to a specific height and they're very, very small. However, they have the characteristics of an indeterminate tomato plant, as they're going to continue to produce small amounts of fruit continuously throughout the year. So what is the purpose of pruning our tomato plants? And it is essentially to keep our plants as healthy as possible and keeping them producing as long as possible. That is our goal when we're growing our tomato plants. And I can tell you right now, if you don't want to prune, don't prune. But then you're going to have a wild mess on your hands similar to what I have right now, because I've sacrificed my plants a little bit just to show you all what I'm going to be doing. All of these tomato plants right here on my trellises are indeterminate tomatoes, and the tomatoes I had growing in my grow bags are all determinate tomatoes, and I space them apart from each other purposefully because I know they have different pruning habits. There is one circumstance where you're going to prune your tomato plants regardless of the type 100% of the time, and that is when you see the triple Ds: diseased, dead, or dying. Like this plant right here, anytime you see this type of foliage on your plant, you definitely want to remove it. Or if you could see these leaves right here are starting to get some disease, we want to remove this branch as well. This is going to be a vector for disease, not only on this plant, but the potential for it to spread from plant to plant. So for that reason, anytime we see these types of leaves, we want to remove them from our tomato plants. Now let's get into the specifics. For our determinate tomatoes, you're never going to prune them. The only circumstance is that 100% of the time case, which I just said, which is the triple Ds. Other than that, we are not going to be pruning our determinate tomato plants ever, because as we said before, they have a determined height and they're going to produce a determined amount of fruit. And we want to prune our tomato plants to keep them healthy. They're going to grow enough foliage to grow the fruit that they need. So for that reason, we're not going to prune them except for removing these dead, diseased, and decaying leaves and branches, because we know that is going to cause for an unhealthy tomato plant. So again, if you see plants or leaves like this, you absolutely want to remove them from your determinate tomatoes. But other than that, you're not going to be doing any pruning to your determinate tomato plants at all. And notice I'm using this alcohol spray here. I 100% am using this in between plants, but if you have a diseased branch and an undiseased branch, I would also recommend spraying your pruners in between those cuts as well. And since our determinate tomatoes and our dwarf tomatoes act very similarly in regards to their growth habits, this exact same process or principles applies to your dwarf tomato plants as well. So the only time you're pruning your determinates or your dwarf tomato plants is when they have diseased, dead, or dying foliage. Now with that, let's get into the more complex, bigger brother of the determinate tomatoes, the indeterminates. First, I want to talk about how I prune my indeterminate tomatoes because I have a very specific setup here. I'm using a lean and lower trellis, which uses these J-hooks right here, and they have raveled up twine, which allows me to lower this trellis as my tomato plants grow, which means that this trellis is essentially an infinite trellis and can handle those plants growing literally as tall as they possibly can, sometimes upwards of 20 feet tall. And this is absolutely why I love this tomato trellis. And because of the specific setup I have, I'm pruning all of my indeterminate tomato plants to one central leader. That means I'm going to have one main stem, like you could see on this tomato plant right here, one main stem with the sun leaves coming out, as well as these branches of fruit coming off. If you're familiar with growing tomatoes, you've probably heard of the term suckers before, and let's find one. Here's a great example on this plant right here. I have my sun leaf coming off of this main stem right here, and then this sucker is growing out on a 45-degree angle. On all of my indeterminate tomato plants, I prune off the suckers. The reason being is because I'm growing my tomato plants so close together, and any of this additional foliage is going to be a vector for disease and unhealthiness. So in my very specific situation, that's why I am removing my suckers. But if you notice on here, we have some flowers, which means that suckers can grow fruit. Suckers will actually become another main stem of your tomato plant. So if you have the space, depending on what type of trellis you're using, I would recommend letting your tomato plants grow to either 2 to 3 suckers. So you'll have your main central leader with an additional 2 to 3 suckers. This will allow you to grow as many tomatoes as you possibly can while maintaining a healthy plant for each individual plant. But as I said, since I'm growing my tomato plants so close together, it really is an insurance policy for me in order to prune these plants to a central leader. Because if I lose this tomato plant, I'm most likely not going to lose the other plants around it, and that's my insurance policy. So what I'm going to be doing is working through every single one of these tomato plants and removing all of the suckers I see in order to focus on growing the fruit, like on my Sun Gold cherry tomato right here. Look at that beautiful fruit set. May have picked some off already, but that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So at every single sucker, I'm going to be pruning these off in order to focus all the energy on this fruit set right here. That was a big sucker right there. That big sucker of a tomato plant. I told you I sacrificed a little bit for you guys. The amazing thing about your tomatoes is that I pruned off this sucker. It's got plenty of leaves and plenty of fruit on this. I can actually take this plant and I'm gonna remove about 90, we'll say 80% of it. I'm gonna cut the stem at a 75-degree angle and I'm gonna remove this bottom leaf right there, or this branch. Now, if I put this in water, root this in water, I have a brand new tomato plant that I can then plant anywhere else in the garden later in the year. And now I have another layer of insurance for this beautiful Sun Gold tomato. If this plant were to die, I could take this rooted sucker, plant it right in that spot, and we can keep on growing our cherry tomatoes. So there is another great benefit to removing your suckers as your tomato plants grow. Now I just want to work on this plant and apply the principles that we've been talking about. So I've got some dead foliage right here. I'm going to be removing that. We've got another one right here. Here's another sucker. I'm going to take that off, and I'm just working my way up the plant. We've got some diseased leaves here, so I'm going to wind up taking these off just like that and like that. And you can see how this process becomes very smooth once you begin to familiarize yourself with these principles. And as you can see, this tomato plant's going to keep growing up. Before I get to the top, I want to come back down to the bottom and show you what the bottom of this plant looks like. If you notice, at the bottom of the plant, there is no foliage, very, very little foliage, and all of my ground is covered. At least the bottom 18 inches or so of your indeterminate plant, you want to remove all of that foliage once you get your first fruit set. The reason being is because there's plenty of new growth at the top of the plant. It's getting plenty of sunlight, and if you look down here, you can even see it on my face. It's shaded. These leaves are not going to get as much sunlight, and there's also the potential for disease getting splashed up from the soil and onto those plants, which again is going to become a vector for disease that gets spread across your whole crop. So once your first fruit set sets, prune all those leaves off, at least up to the first fruit set, maybe even second. Now, as we're going up the plant again, once my tomato plant gets to the top of my trellis, and as I said, I have the ability to lower the plant down, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And since my plant can grow infinitely, every time I get a new fruit set, I'm going to be pruning off all of the leaves that are underneath that fruit set. Because I'm going to be lowering that plant down, those leaves are going to get even closer to the ground, and I don't want to splash disease on the plant. So you can see how this is a continual process, something that you're going to have to do throughout the year. Now, if you don't have a lean and lower tomato trellis like me, and you're still growing an indeterminate tomato plant, one thing that you can do is called topping, and it sounds like exactly what it is. Once your plant reaches the top of the trellis, you're going to simply cut off the top of the plant, and that will prevent the plant from growing even taller. Now, if you haven't pruned off all the suckers, you might still have some suckers growing off the top of your plant, and you're going to want to remove those as well, because that's going to become the new main central leader, and it's just going to keep on growing. But topping off a plant characteristically is going to force the plant to go into fruit production, and all of the vegetation you have left is going to focus on that. So you are going to be stimulating the end of the life for the plant, but you're going to see your fruit production skyrocket before it dies off. So now I'm going to be going through all of my tomato plants, getting them pruned to what they should be looking like at the current stage of growth, and then we'll show you how they look. So you've probably noticed this sweet shirt, and a lot of you have been asking about it. Well, I wanted to let you all know that it is officially for sale on our Etsy page, which you can find in the description below. This shirt right here, designed by yours truly, and every shirt that's purchased directly impacts our ability to grow and continue to help grow the gardener in you. Thanks for supporting Earth Nails and Tails. Now back to tomato pruning. And there we go. You can see all of this foliage that I just took off these tomato plants, and honestly, you do not want to let them get this far. If you stay on top of these indeterminate tomatoes, it's going to make your life so much easier. But now you can see the full beauty of what we're producing here. This is why we're taking care of these plants to produce these beautiful tomatoes that are on their way to ripening to some amazing fruit. And after seeing this process, maybe this has changed your mindset a little bit. At the end of the day, you really need to understand what your goals are. You need to understand what type of tomato plants you want to grow, or what type of fruit you want to grow and what you want to be eating. and seeing what it takes in order to properly maintain these plants might wave you a little bit in one direction or another. Maybe you don't want to be pruning your tomato plants to a main central leader like I do, so providing your tomato plants with a little bit more space to just go wild might be your option, or sticking with some determinate type plants and growing some more Roma type varieties that you don't have to prune except for removing this disease fruit might be more of your style. But in either circumstance, I hope this video provided you the information on the principles behind pruning these tomato plants in order to allow you to have the healthiest tomato plants that you can and grow as much delicious fruit as possible.